Hi, everybody. I'm Clay Smith. I'm the literary director of the San Antonio Book Festival. Welcome to the second day of the festival. We hope you're engaging and loving all these writers that we brought to you. I'm here to moderate a panel about historical fiction. We've got two really talented writers with us, writing about different moments in history, but we put this panel together partly because of the pandemic, because we felt like people are sick of being stuck at home, and a good read that takes them far away from the here and now is something that everybody might want. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, about the nuances of reading novels set in a totally different time and place when we are stuck at home. Let me tell you a little bit about Signe and Afia. Afia Atkora was born in the United Kingdom and raised in New Jersey, where she now lives. She graduated from New York University and has an MFA from Columbia University, where she was the recipient of the De Alba Fellowship. Her fiction has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and she was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Award for College Writers. Her debut novel is titled Conjure Women, and it is just out now in paperback. And Signe Pike is the author of The Forgotten Kingdom, The Lost Queen, and the travel memoir Fairy Tale. And she has researched and written about Celtic history and folklore for more than a decade. You can visit her at signepike.com. So let me just encourage you to buy our writers' books. If you go to the session details page, you will find the Buy the Books link. It goes right to Nowhere Bookshop. Nowhere Bookshop is a new indie bookstore in San Antonio. Really great to support our indies during the pandemic. They had a hard time being shut up and just doing curbside. So I want to just encourage you to consider buying our writers' books. And whether you are here in San Antonio or far away, they can ship them to you or do curbside if you live here in San Antonio. Another thing to tell you is please ask your questions in the Q&A box. I know you've got those questions and we want to hear from you, and we can't see you, but we want to engage with you and hear what you're thinking and have to say. So please do place your questions in the Q&A box. Yeah, so I was talking a little bit about this panel. Let's see, what did we call this one? Take Me Away From Here, fiction set long ago. Which makes it sound a little bit like these are escapist novels. These are not escapist novels. There's quite a bit of trauma, war, post-Civil War, the immediate sort of aftermath of slavery in the United States. So a lot of harsh stuff going on, but they are still really thrilling reads. So as I said a little bit earlier, we'll talk a little bit about the complexities of reading stuff set in another place and time when you don't necessarily love the time in which you live right here and now. So these novels are different enough that I'm going to ask questions of Afia and then questions of Signe, and then we'll sort of come together and talk about their novels together and historical fiction as a topic. So Afia, I saw an interview, I think it was with Library Journal. You said, quote, "We tend to paint slavery in America with broad strokes." So I just, tell us a little bit about Conjure Women. How did you want to complicate that slavery story in America or make it more nuanced? Because I think you're right that we do tend to paint slavery in America with broad strokes. So how did you hope to sort of complicate that story?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for having me. Lovely to be here. Thank you, Clay, for hosting. Yeah, I think just looking at the reason I wrote the book and the reason I was drawn to the topic was because I personally felt that I, had, an American education and an understanding of slavery as sort of this thing that, atrocious, Civil War, it ended, slaves were free. And for me, that's sort of, I didn't question it for too long, but I think as I got older, I started to think, all right, if I was one of those people, if I was suddenly handed freedom, what would that look like? What would that feel like? How do you define that? It felt like the people and the difference of opinions and the difference of nuance was sort of not explored in those historical, margins. And so what I really wanted to look at was the Reconstruction Era, um, which I had heard about, again, as this sort of like, okay, war's over, we're fixing what was destroyed, what was lost. But it sort of struck me in my research as a very sort of fixed point in time, right? 10 years, which is surprising, I think, in history to be able to mark something so definitively. Um, but also as this time where there was so much promise and hope, especially for Black people, for recently enslaved people, to sort of define what they wanted the world to look like for themselves. And so I definitely wanted to put myself in that position and think, what would I hope for? What would I fear? And what would my hesitations be? And so I think just the psychological aspect of history is something that I think we don't unpack as much as we ought to. And so that was really my entry point into looking at slavery and really looking at those people. And it is a dark time. It is something I think we all kind of flinch away from. But I really wanted to sort of look unflinchingly at what it would mean for each individual person.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things about your novel is, when we use the term, like a book critic like me uses the term world building, it's usually used in terms of fantasy novels. You hear that a lot because a fantasy novelist builds an entire world. It may be in space, it may be on a planet like, very far away. Your world is here in America, in the South. And yet this place that you have set up is sort of marooned, it's not on an island, it's on, terra firma in America. But tell us about that. I mean, you set up a whole world here, and I just want to hear a little bit more about that, how you sort of envision that.
Yeah. I love the comparison to fantasy because that is absolutely one of my my favorite genres, and I think the book inhabits that a little bit with the magic realism. But yeah, the world building for me was about inhabiting the South as sort of an amalgamation of all these different ideas that we have about it and these sort of the lore of the South. So in Conjure Women, the setting isn't a specific town. It isn't historically based in that sense, but it is sort of a study of what different locations and what sort of ideas form the South for an onlooker and for sort of a reader. For example, I looked at Tennessee Williams, looked at Faulkner to sort of think of how do we romanticize the South? How do we romanticize this time? And what does that look like in a town? Is that a dirt road? And what is the romance of a dirt road? Is that a destroyed plantation home? And what is the romance? Was the darkness in a plantation home? All these sorts of ideas that we still carry today. I wanted to use them to build this town in the most nuanced sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was it like to, I mean, not just historical novelists, but every novelist, short story writer, every fiction writer, we expect to place yourselves inside the minds of your characters. A particularly harsh task for you, a very hard life that your characters have. Let's have some therapy here. Like, how did that feel for you? What was that like?
Yeah. I mean, it was harrowing. I think again, I never thought I would write a slavery novel. I think there is again sort of this feeling of that's been told, and it's ugly and harsh, and why look at that again? And so I really wanted to again inhabit the characters, inhabit the people of that time, and sort of reclaim what is lost in our uncomfortability, in our looking away from that time, sort of reclaim the people that would be lost if we didn't look at this harsh history. And then so just in the research, I think just discovering those individual people, those individual names. And one of the things that one of my research sort of steps that figured into the novel, not as much as I think it's something I'll hold with me and hopefully read about again, but one of the things I was able to do was I went to West Africa, where my family is from, and I went to a slave castle, and just sort of walked around and was able to see, they have the chains still there, they have the prisons still there, they have the bedrooms still there, and there's this sort of window that you look out of and see the sea, and it's sort of the last thing, the last look at home that these slaves would have had. And just looking at that, I think it definitely made me feel like I had to write these characters and I had to give them all of that complexity and all of that horror, and also the sense of making a new home, of defining yourself in a new country, and defining yourself in a new freedom. And so I think that really touched me and is something I continually went back to as I was writing, to sort of do right by that last view of home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you went to go sort of, confront that past and try to feel what it would have been like for your characters. And instead of it scaring you away, you just dove headlong into it. I mean, it's nice that having that scene convinced you that you should be writing this novel, right?
Exactly. And I think for me, it was a personal thing because, again, that's where my family's from. That was the first time I had ever been in Africa, in West Africa, and sort of, wanting to do right by traditions and family, and really feeling a connection that I wasn't expecting to feel. It really it solidified the stories and the connections between the women and the stories and the things that are passed down, and how do you make a little Africa in America? How do you preserve that part of yourself?
Yeah. So tell us, there's a baby born in your novel, and something is unique about her. And in fact, this arises tomorrow. You're going to moderate an event for us, and something similar happens in one of the novels you're moderating for us tomorrow. Tell us a little bit about what people can expect in the plot of the novel.
Yeah. So tomorrow I get to moderate Call Baby by Morgan Jerkins, and also Liberté by Caitlin Greenridge. And so I love those echoes. Little spot for that. Go see that tomorrow. But the idea of the call is really interesting in sort of African lore, and especially West African history. And so, again, looking at my own history and sort of what my family knew about the call, which is babies born. It's fairly rare. Babies born entirely encased in their amniotic sac. And so when that would happen in sort of these rural places, without the help of Google or without the help of sort of a medical school or medical knowledge, there was sort of this sense that it had a deeper meaning, that it had properties. And so one of the things that comes up again and again in Africa and in the United States is this idea that the call protects and also provides the ability to see either into the future or see, into the hearts of people. And so the fact that endured, that sort of lore endured across, the Atlantic Passage, and stayed in the minds of people, was something I was absolutely fascinated by. And that's something that comes up again and again in the novel, is the things that sort of are held, the songs and the traditions that are passed down. And I think the call, especially this belief that there's sort of hope, but something larger, perhaps darker, perhaps that it gives some kind of protection. Just the idea that there was something greater outside the world of a plantation, or outside the world of slavery, that couldn't quite be explained, felt like a very logical point to start the novel.
Yeah. And so the inhabitants of the don't know, not town is not even the right word. The village, maybe the area, whatever. It's a small place. Are they don't really warm up to this baby in the beginning, right? Because she's born with this cold.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of, again, going back to the psychological aspect, a lot of what I wanted to unpack was the fear of freedom, the fear of suddenly being unmoored, even if it was from something painful or atrocious, just the feeling that you now have the power to make your own life. And so the characters in the novel sort of take the call baby as a bad omen, as perhaps retribution for their own happiness or their own joy. And again, I wrote this novel well before our current time, but I think, looking at the pandemic or looking at any difficulty in your life, you want to know the source of it. You want to be able to blame it on something or say that it was above your control. And so I think that's something that I really wanted to explore in terms of these characters. How do they sort of diffuse the fear of freedom, or diffuse the fear of being brought back into slavery? How do they sort of reconcile this new world and the power that they do or don't have within it?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about those details. So Signe, we're moving from immediate post-Civil War America to very different 6th century Scotland. Signe's new novel is titled The Forgotten Kingdom. It's actually a sequel to The Lost Queen. And there is one queen. We're talking about Langoreth. And Signe has spent a lot of time thinking about her. So, Signe, I just want you to tell us a little bit, about where you're picking up with Langoreth in The Forgotten Kingdom, this new book. And it has kind of been, in the real world, outside of the world of the novel, a real world project for you to sort of, I don't know, resuscitate her legend, because in her own time, she was quite legendary. And now, for a number of unjust reasons, we have forgotten about her. So tell us a little bit about where we're picking up in The Forgotten Kingdom and why you think it's important to remind us about her in the real world.
So The Forgotten Kingdom opens with Langoreth imprisoned in her own chamber as there's this battle happening. And this is a real battle that happened. It's what you read about in the very end of The Lost Queen, this battle called the Battle of Ardereth. And Langoreth had really high stakes in this battle because her own husband was fighting against her own brother. So her husband was fighting against her brother. They were on warring sides. And we know too that her eldest son was at that battle as well, and that he didn't survive. So this is a problem. Sorry for the spoiler, but this is a problem with historical fiction. We know these things before we set out, So this battle was actually one of the things that made me want to write about Langoreth's life. And something that I thought was interesting about what Afia said was standing in that slave castle, looking out the window, the pressure, I think, and the weight and the desire to try to write that story, because you feel like you want to do justice to all those lives that have gone unsung, is the same thing, the same way that I felt about Langoreth when I thought about the fact that she'd survived this battle, the fact that she lived at a time when Christianity was just starting to gain footing in Scotland, and it was not in a peaceable way. Although in classical literature, it's portrayed that way. When you look back at the sources and you do your interpretations, that really wasn't what was taking place. It was a very violent transition. She was in the middle of it. And from all we can tell, she was from a family that was polytheistic, believing in the old gods, but yet she married a Christian king. So thinking about her life and what she suffered made me want to bear witness to it. And so it's only fitting that book 2 opens up, right after that battle. And so And a lot of it too, the fun part about Forgotten Kingdom is that unlike The Lost Queen, I wrote mostly from Langoris' point of view. In The Forgotten Kingdom, I got to write from Lailakin, her brothers, who is the man who had, the historical figure who is now known as the wizard Merlin. But he was really just a politician and a druid and a warrior who fought in this battle of Ardered. So that's how it opens up. And that's what really, really pushed me to write about her.
And you, I mean, you, as I said in your intro, you do have a previous nonfiction book where you traveled to all around. Like Afia, did you go to a specific place in the UK that sort of gave you fuel and inspired you?
I went to, when I was researching this book, I went to this place outside of Glasgow called Châtelherault Country Park. And on those grounds that are preserved, there are the ruins of a castle. And beneath the medieval castle, we think would be the ruins of the wooden fortress where Langorith lived in the 6th century. And it was walking those woods and by, looking at the river and seeing the ferns. And I was thinking about her growing up as a child there and how she had no idea how her life was going to change. That was one of the places, but I went to pretty much all of the places that are in the book. She spent a lot of time on Dumbarton Rock, where you can still go today in the town of Dumbarton. It's this giant volcanic plug that sits in the middle of 2 different rivers. And she spent a lot of time there, and I've stood on the edge of the ramparts of Clyde Rock looking out over the water. It's trippy to be able to go visit these places where your characters actually lived and breathed. And it's almost as though you can still feel a piece of them there.
Yeah. You mentioned this a little bit, but I'm Langorith moving from sort of the old gods to the Christian life that she entered into. I mean, that's really fascinating. And it's when an entire culture changes, that seems difficult to write about because we expect a novelist to write with specificity, and it's through specificity that you can evoke a whole world and a life for your reader. Tell us a little bit about kind of studying that move from, I don't know if you'd call it matriarchy or paganism, or what is the right term, and how you sort of anchored that in specificity in a specific character.
So researching the pre-Christian religion in Scotland and in the Celtic Isles is tough because we don't have a lot of written materials. There are almost none. It was an oral tradition, and it was a sacred tradition, and so the knowledge was kept orally so that it would not fall into the hands of people who weren't trained as druids or initiates. But what's fallen back to us, today is we still have all of the festivals. Like, a lot of people don't know that where the Easter Bunny comes from. The Easter Bunny is actually a leftover tack-on that Christianity kind of plugged into the Jesus story. But really, the Easter Bunny was the hare and the sort of consort of the goddess of Easter, Ostara, who is a Celtic goddess. And every Easter, the Celts would welcome spring. And so the hare was her consort. And so now we have Easter bunnies showing up with, a resurrection. And it was because, this was all centered around this full moon that comes in spring. And the people were so ingrained and so attached to the cycles and to their worship of those aspects of the natural world still in the Celtic Isles that eventually Christianity found it easier to be able to just incorporate some of the elements of the previous religion into the new one. And that's what enabled it to gain some sticking power. But the Celtic religion pre-Christian was very nature-based. It was, also very localized, which a lot of people don't realize. Like, if I live on Sullivan's Island, we would have our inlets and creeks would be thought to have their own spirits. It's not unlike indigenous African religion in that way. There's nature spirits that are attached to place, and so each tribe, each Celtic tribe, and I know each African tribe as well, has their connections to certain mythological figures and gods and goddesses that are attached to these elements of the natural world. So that was really Langoris world. So when I write about that, we were talking about fantasy earlier, and I also really love to read fantasy too. And one of the things that's interesting about writing about pre-Christian religion is that because I write about, let's say an Easter ceremony or a Samhain ceremony at Halloween, and something happens, like a character does a incantation and then they believe it to have had power, it comes true, so they think, in the following pages, that's seen as fantasy. Whereas if you have a Christian character who says a prayer and believes that the prayer saved somebody, that's still considered in the realms of historical fiction. So that's one of the challenges of writing about this, is having to piece together the elements of their religion and also trying to communicate the fact to readers that they believed curses held power. Just like in Afia's book, with conjuring, you've got to believe that your curses hold power, and that doll, it represents that person in order to enact the magic. And I liked the way that she, using magical realism, showed characters being influenced, but left it a light enough touch that you wonder, is it nature or is it magic, and what's the fine line between?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think, because Afia, I wanted to ask you, like, when I'm glad you used the term magical realism, because I wasn't sure if you thought of it that way, because, when we think of magical realism, I think the Latin American tradition is probably the first one that we think of. But yeah, I mean, magic in both of your books is something that we could definitely, that is definitely similar in both. So we'll get back to that in just a second. But I do want to ask you about your research, Signe, because we do expect research of all of our historical novelists, but when to stop the research is a major question for historical novelists, because you're so fascinated by it. Like, when do you stop and when do you start imagining? And you in particular, I want to ask this question up because your research was really exhaustive, and you have an author's note that's so it's so thorough and it's so thoughtful, and you're really trying to make a case for Langorith and sort of bringing back the facts of that world. That world is so shrouded in, as you said, wizardry and Merlin and all our sort of preconceived notions of that time and place. And so I'm curious how you knew when to stop doing your research and when to start making stuff up.
I think it's a really intuitive process for me. I won't feel like I can start a story, even with writing the sequel to The Lost Queen. I knew I had The Forgotten Kingdom. I had to do a lot of new research on the angles and on these different cultures that were now coming into play in a greater way. And I won't feel like I can start. I almost feel internally as if there's this blockage of writing, writer's block or just a roadblock. And once I start the research process, things start sparking with me, and I'll read about something. I'll read about, training golden eagles, or read about, a festival or a certain element or story that will just stick. And I feel that spark of excitement, and then I know it's time to go. And likewise, when it's time to stop is usually when I'll get stuck. I won't know enough about a certain moment or a certain battle to move forward, and I'll have to go in and hit the books for a while, and then I get the idea again, and I get the spark, and I return to the page. So it's very intuitive for me, but the research is kind of ongoing, and because I'm so fascinated, it crosses cultures, and it's just exhaustive, and it's forever. It's when I'm on vacation in Mexico, I'm looking for connections about ancient holidays and ancient worship, and I just love it. I think I just live and breathe the research, really, and the trick becomes trying to keep it from overwhelming the narrative and the imaginative parts, which are also fun, because that's the part where you sit and you've digested all of the research, and I sit in my chair and I start to hear the lines of the story. And that's when I try to just get out of the way and just listen to the story and just take it down.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting because one of our writers yesterday was saying, who also writes historical fiction, that he doesn't do any research and then, writes the first draft and then he does the research to go back and check, to sort of invest a little bit of factual reality into a fictional narrative. And so there's, for anyone watching who wants to be a historical fiction writer, there's all kinds of ways to do it. Don't you all agree?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's weird as writers, the things that we are particular about. I don't feel that I can just sketch a scene out and leave out all the details and flesh it in later. As a child, I was the messiest. My mom is watching and would tell you, the messiest child ever. My room was just a pile of dirty clothes and stuffed animals. But as a writer and as an adult, I'm so type A. I can see Afia nodding. I'm so type A that I have to get those details in. There's almost a control element. I feel like I might lose them or they might slip through if I don't put them in that draft. So it takes me longer to write drafts. It takes me longer to write in general because of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think I need to have all the information before I can dive into that scene, and then not everything makes it onto the page. But I think being able to say visualize a room and understand what kind of oven somebody had or what kind of bed they might have slept in, just being able to move around their space and feel confident in the knowledge of that time period. And then what sticks is, again, I love that phrase, what sparks, that Signe used. What sparks you kind of becomes the engine to create these scenes. And then even the roadblocks, I think sometimes you'll encounter. For me, there's a character, Verena, who's sort of a Southern belle that's thrown down. And I didn't really know a lot about the Civil War when I began the novel, and so I started to read diaries just to be able to see diaries of women of that time period and wives and daughters, and that really formed the character for me. So sort of not knowing things led me to sort of come up with plots for her that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So you all don't forget to put your questions in the chat or Q&A boxes, and we'll try to get to some of those questions before we close down here. But I want to know about, moving from post-Civil War Southern America to 16th century Scotland. Like, you do your research, it's 2020 or 2019, whenever you're writing your book, you're about to turn it in. You've got to know the period you're writing about, but you wake up in 2019. And first of all, are there any rituals you did, no matter how like cheesy or bizarre they may have been, to help you get into the mood? Like, was there music? And then secondly, I know I'm sort of playing therapist here today, but how did it feel like to go from these different time periods? We expect writers to spend all day, historical novels at least, in a different period. And then you've got to get out of that period, take care of kids, or go to the grocery store, or whatever you have to do. How did that feel to you all?
Well, I think for me, I have developed a ritual. I sit and I light a candle and sit and meditate for a few minutes just to clear my head out of the mental burden list of all of the grocery shopping and kids stuff, and all the worries and everything. Try to disconnect from that and make the space for the writing. And then I sit and I try to listen and just allow, because I feel like so many times, I'm a former book editor, and because I love editing, such a critic, and I can be such a harsh critic on myself. I know we all can be. So it's about finding a space where I can silence the outside thoughts, but also silence that inner critic and that inner voice, and just allow a draft to come through. But I do find that when, I'm curious to see what Afia says, but when I am in the moment and then I leave the desk, I almost feel as though sounds are louder. I get startled more easily. I found I almost have to find a way to wrap it and pull my energy back in before I just stop writing and go out into the day, because otherwise I end up feeling really jarred and sort of half in my body. And it took me a while to realize, when I started inhabiting this world part of the time and then going to pick up my son from daycare, just jumping in and out, that it was almost like, in some of the indigenous cultures, they call it soul loss. And it's when you travel sort of, in your mind, in a ritual to some other place, and you come back to abruptly. There's this idea of soul loss. And I think that's what I was starting to feel a little bit, was just not grounded and jolted. So now I'll try to, I blow out the candle. I take that moment to sort of recollect myself before I go out into the world.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, for a feeling that I absolutely have. I tend to write at night, and I think part of that is imitating what I did as a child, which would be like read under the covers with like a flashlight, and sort of that hazy, half sleepy world where everything sort of doesn't exist, where the daily grind doesn't exist, and you're just part of the book. And so I think I try to recreate that feeling. And when I feel that sort of like half asleep, like I shouldn't be writing, I should be sleeping, that sort of haze, I think that's when the best work happens. And then I do have sort of that fugue when I come back. My husband will speak to me and I won't answer right away. And he'll be like, oh, you were writing, weren't you? And it is sort of this headspace that is a little bit magical. And when it's happening, you go there. Yeah, but I need the one where I come back. I need to put the candle out a little bit more. That's it. Yeah, but the rituals do help for sure.
The candle. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to jolt yourself back a little bit, because you do go someplace else, I think, when you write.
Yeah. Did you all ever have, especially Signe, for you, this is your second book in this time period. Did you, but did either of you have any doubts about investing in the settings and the time and the place that you've chosen as your settings? Because it's a commitment. You're going to spend a few years at least in that world. What has to be exactly right about those periods for you to say, okay, I'm going to spend time there?
For me, it was the emotional weight. I don't want to call it the burden, but I would say the emotional burden of wanting to communicate this story, not just of Langorith, but really it's the Britons, and it's the end of their culture. So I'm chronicling the end of a time for a whole people. And after the time that I'm writing, nothing was ever the same for them ever again. So at the end of book 3, it's completely, there's a new world happening, and it left all of these people behind. So for me, I always knew it was going to be 3 books. I knew I was going to be spending that amount of time here, and I just didn't know how it would feel, but I knew it just had to be the way it was. There wasn't really an option. And then you were asking what our fears are. I've been really fortunate enough to option television rights, and as we get closer to producing a show, terrified about all of the inaccuracies, the things that I must have gotten wrong, because I'm a single person and a single mother, and I'm a book editor, and I'm researching 6th century Scotland. And yes, I've done it for years, but I'm not a trained historian. I've made mistakes already. So I'm just terrified about all the mistakes that are yet to be unearthed, because no one can be perfect. It's not ever going to be perfect. It's terrifying, especially in a period that has, almost zero archaeological footprint. So there's a lot of things you do have to do some guesswork on.
Yeah. I'm friends with Stephen Saylor, historical novelist who sets mysteries in ancient Rome. And he's told me about readers and I was a Latin major, so, I'd love to read stuff set in ancient Rome, but he's told me about readers who would, email him and say, you said that such and such happened, and it couldn't have happened that year. It had to have happened a year later or whatever. And, there's a point where like, you want to tell the reader, you can't really tell the reader, but just believe in it. Maybe I got a fact wrong, but the essential sort of truth of the character and of the plot is still there, right?
I hope so. I'm curious to know if Afia's gotten any of those kinds of pings
I think like I said before, I think I get away with it by saying it's not a real town and it's not beholden to anything specific in that way. But I mean, absolutely. As I said, there are people that know a lot about the Civil War, and I was not one of them when I came to this story. And so, just the battles, just who would be president at the exact time, like things like that. I feel like I kept having to go back and check, and I'm sure I didn't get all of it right, but I think it's what I felt most beholden to, I think, is the characters and just trying to make a truth for them, and knowing that each individual experience is going to be different. We're not all having the same experience of the pandemic, but I think, years from now there'll again be a blanket sort of definition of what was. And so I like to say I can get away with that a little bit, by really focusing in on the characters and what their specific experience would be like. But absolutely, there's always the reader that said they didn't have this and this before, this period. And again, those challenges, I think, also form the novel. If something wasn't invented yet, how do you get around that? How do you unpack that sort of experience for the character can blossom a whole plot? So I try to lean in, and I think you're good, Signe. I'm thrilled to dive into Scotland, so I don't think anyone's going to be arguing with you.
So Afia, your sort of mention of the importance of character and the truth of character brings me to this point of, we did call this panel, Take Me Away From Here, but people had similar miseries at the time that you're writing, and also in 6th century Scotland, as they have now. People worrying about the meaning of their lives. Who are they going to fall in love with? All of these, essential questions that all of us face when we're alive. A lot of us, well, let me not generalize. Let me talk about myself. I'm a little frustrated with the time in which we live, not just because of the pandemic, but there's something a little bit itchy about being alive right now in a sort of in a wealthy country, let's say, where we have access to social media. I can find out what people that I attended junior high are doing. Not sure I want to know every single day what they're doing. So we're both, as words were said, like too much with the world, and it's hard to get away from it. And so we can turn to historical fiction for taking us to a totally different world. And yet we get into, good historical novels like yours, and we find that the characters faced very similar situations that we do. What do you think is going on there, where we want to escape to a different world, and yet we sort of know deep down that the characters are going to be a little bit like us, right?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the main things about just being a reader is reading is one of the ways you get to inhabit someone else's brain, right? It's the only way. Let's say that you get to know what someone else is really thinking deep down. And so I think there's a draw to that. I mean, we really want to look through someone else's eyes. And so there's a draw to being in a different world. There's a draw to escaping our day to day. But I think at the same time, we want to find ourselves in those stories. We want to find ourselves in those characters. We want to know that we're not alone, even if it seems like a faraway place, that we have the same sort of emotions and worries, and we want to live through them and sort of see how they solve them and see if we might solve them. And if they don't, how you sort of make peace with that. And so I think just reading in general is all about escaping to find yourself, as it were. And so I think historical fiction is one of the quickest ways to sort of come back to yourself by going far away. Yeah.
What about you, Signe?
I think that we are, I liked what Afia said about wanting to see yourself. I think we're always looking to understand more about our lives and our existence and what it means to be human. And I think that's why we like to try on all these hats that we can wear when you open the pages of a book, is to understand better what it means to be human by reading about other experiences. And then when you find these common threads of heartbreak and love and loss and resilience, it's what makes us come out of that story feeling more hopeful and feeling stronger. Because even though we've read, elements of a story that are completely made up, all of those elements that are emotional feel so true. That's what's true. That's the one real thing. It's Hemingway who said, write about one true thing, and it's the emotions that we can all connect with. And they help us better understand ourselves and understand how we want to live in a different way. That's why I love writing about the 6th century. When we used to read about, people used to study, and the natural world was their main source of knowledge. And I think that we're just coming back to that way of being and thinking. And I think the pandemic really was a big part of that. People started planting their own gardens. They started baking their own bread. They started going into their backyards and noticing the wildlife for the first time, because we were taken out of that social media machine that you're talking about. We were taken, a lot of us turned away from it because it was too much. It was sensory overload, and we sunk back into our lives. And that's the one thing I worry that we're going to lose as we move forward. Are we just going to click back onto the track and off we go to the races? And we forget about all of the really beautiful lessons that we learned during the pandemic. A lot of them were reviving really deeply ancestral things that are important to us about being human and feeling connected to where we live and the earth and what sustains us.
Yeah, no, that's so true. You read all these really hopeful articles like, the pandemic is a perfect time to reform the bail system in the United States for reasons X, Y, and Z. And, now that we're sort of coming back to, reality or the life before, you want to believe all of those things. And yet you sort of wonder if all the hopes that we have, the things that we learned during this pandemic of how to be with ourselves and how to be with our loved ones, if those will remain, certainly hope so. There will be a historical novel written one day about the COVID-19
No one
pandemic.
can want to read about that.
I don't want to read about it, but
it's gonna, yeah.
I wonder, I can't think of, I know there's good nonfiction, even good nonfiction that's been published recently about the Spanish flu, but I'm trying to think of novels that are set during the pandemic from 100 years ago. So
yeah,
I'm sure they're out there.
It's like you say with a joke, too soon? Too soon.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the bias of historical fiction writers, but I don't want to dive in right now.
Yeah. So let's talk about magic. It certainly exists in Afia's novel. Signe, do you, the sort of, the old religion that your characters practice for part of the novel, do they think of that as magic? Is magic the right term, or just religion?
I think for them it was religion, but their religion was magical. So there wasn't really, that's modern thinking to try and differentiate between the two. It was what it was. It was that when you perform these rites going back to ancient times, you could try to have some influence over the crops. And there were saints too that were doing things like weather working. Like if you read Saint Columba's hagiography, he talks about people would come to him and ask him to pray for a fair wind so they could sail across the water on a treacherous day, and he would pray and a fair wind would come and off the boat would go. So it was just part of their lexicon of belief.
Mm-hmm. And what about in your novel, Afia? Are the elements that we would think of as magical realism, these former slaves attempt to reconnect with where their ancestry originally comes from Africa, or what? How do you think of that?
Yeah. I think, again, I love what Signe said about, the intersection of what we think is magic versus what we think is religion, and sort of um, the way that Christianity sort of, again, borrows and makes these concessions to these firm held beliefs. And so I think that is a lot of what the book explores. My book explores, is reconciling sort of your traditions with the dominant religion, with sort of the practices that you don't even question. If someone throws salt over their shoulders, is that magic? Is that religion? And so all those things, those traditions that give us some kind of strength, or give us some kind of hope, or sense of control, I think all overlap. And that was really what I wanted to explore, was, okay, what happens when one of those traditions is seen as evil, or is against Christianity, or is seen as a threat, and why is it seen as a threat? And so, yeah, part of that is sort of finding the magic in religion, and finding the religion in magic, and reconciling what you believe you can do, and what power you believe that you hold in yourself.
Yeah. So Afia, you said that the village, or whatever the correct term is, that you established is totally made up. And we have a question for Signe, but I think in a way it applies to Afia also, because I believe that you sort of read the famous slave narratives that we have, that documentarians took of the former slaves in the early 20th century. And the question is, since you're writing about actual historical characters, Kim B has this question: since you're writing about actual historical characters, how do you find yourself being able to write about their lives and events that happen to them in a historical fictional sense rather than a nonfiction sense? And how do you, if you do, incorporate actual fictional characters? I think she might mean actual people into the story, into your fiction.
Yeah. So many of my characters, aren't specifically, Rue is the main character. It doesn't exist in the sense of there was someone with that name. But was there a Conjure Woman? Certainly. And what does that life look like? And I think it's in part taking those facts and running away with them. Like we said earlier, there's sort of a parameter for what her life might have looked like. But some detail will spark, whether it's, a spell that was done with hair, or, the use of an egg, and what that symbolizes will let me create an entire, little subplot of her, making a spell or what have you. And those things don't exist on the page, but I think you can definitely find them between the lines, and that's where the imagination comes in. I think just sort of envisioning what the day-to-day would be like, away from the sort of marginalia.
Yeah, I'm looking at Kim B's question. So she wants to know, how do you write about their lives and events that happen to them in a fictional sense, and then rather than a nonfiction sense? And I loved Afia's response to that, about, taking the sort of paradigm and fleshing it out with, like Clay was saying, it's the specifics that really add the human connection elements. But for me, it was really interesting because my books are actually based on the scholarship of a bunch of nonfiction books by a man who's now a good friend of mine, Adam Ardrey. He was the first person to write about Lingorith. And what I realized when I read the nonfiction version of her life was that I had the skeleton, and I felt moved by it. I felt that spark, but I knew that in order for her story to reach a broader audience, we had to have the specifics. We had to place her in that hut and animate her and show her life in a way that was much more demonstrative than what nonfiction can offer. So for me, I thought the only way that we can resurrect Langorith is to really fully resurrect her life in commercial fiction. Otherwise, you know, I don't think enough people have found Adam's books, but there are some people who just don't enjoy reading nonfiction. So this was my answer to that, was I think when you add the meat to the bones, that's when you can really forge that connection between someone's life, a character's life, or a real historical figure and the reader. And in order to do that, we have to do the research and then be able to add those elements in. And then she also asked if we incorporate if I incorporate fictional characters into the story, which is a great question. And I do. I base a lot of my main characters are on historical figures, but the fictional characters are the ones, like Afia says, it's that element of imagination. Those are the people who just show up on the page, and they can be the most fun. Like in the Forgotten Kingdom, one of my characters, Diarmid, is this sort of crotchety old druid, and he just showed up on the page with really strong opinions about things, and he's got a great sense of humor. And but yes, he's fictional. And the things that Lilacan and Langorith talk about, there's no record of that. That's all fictional, but we know what the elements were. You know, they were talking about all of those emotional human feelings.
Yeah. We've got another question from Christine. She wants to know, how much of your own life do you put into your historical characters?
I'll let Afia go first.
So I would say, you know, I was writing the novel and sort of going through creating this character of Rue, who is a healing woman in the Reconstruction Era, and her mother was the healing woman in that same town or village during slavery, so a generation earlier. And so Rue spends a lot of time sort of observing her mother and learning from her. And sort of learning the art of taking care of people and healing people. And, you know, I'm working for different variations of that. And my editor says to me, you know, what is this obsession with Rue sort of observing her mother in secret? And I realized that I had forgotten that my mother, when I was a child, was a home health aide. So she would go to different homes, and occasionally, you know, she would take me with her. She, you know, didn't have a babysitter or whatever, and I'd just sit there and I'd be watching TV or whatever in these different houses, but I'd be seeing her interacting with people, interacting with all different people, different ages, different illnesses. And even though I did not go into the medical profession, you know, I think I learned a lot about empathy and how to be an adult and how to be a woman in the world and how to take care of people and what those sort of demands look like. And I had no idea that I was writing about that. You know, I didn't realize until I was, you know, halfway through the book that was something I was exploring, was those things that I had subconsciously sort of witnessed. And so I don't think, I personally don't start out with, I want to write about myself, but there's ways in which you just creep in there, and that your sort of obsessions and the things you go back to are very personal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think to me, it reminds me a little bit, I hope that I'm not putting myself into these books. I mean, that's why I wrote a memoir, and the memoir is all about me and my journey. And I really hope that I'm not putting elements of myself, because I think that would be a disservice to my characters. And in my case, you know, obviously super different from what Afia is talking about. But one thing that I do is I've had all these really mystical experiences in my life in writing fairy tale that I wrote about in the memoir. And I went from being a really skeptical person, from being someone who started to research, you know, these older religions and nature spirits and all these things because of the strange things that happened to me on my journey that I couldn't explain. And the people that I met and the things that just weird things started to happen. I was finding feathers everywhere. I mean, so a lot of the magical elements that I write about, and that I use that knowledge base of what it felt like to sit at a spring when I'm writing. It helps me infuse the book with those sort of religious, spiritual elements. I definitely take from real experiences I've had in my own life. And a really good example is if you ever meet somebody who's a seventh son in Ireland, they say that the seventh son of a seventh son, if he's one of 7 children, has the gift, just like children who are born with the veil, the caul over their bodies. And those people don't have convulsions like you see on Game of Thrones when they're viewing things, when they're divining your future. They just talk. I mean, they're just speaking normally, but they believe they have this ability to access that other place. And so the sort of magical stuff that I write about is really just things that I'm pulling from my own life that I've seen and experienced in the modern world, which is what I think makes it kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much. We're closing it with this idea of the subconscious writing our novels, which sounds wonderful to me. So thank you all for attending, and thank you so much to Afia and Signe for being so thoughtful. And just a reminder to go pick up their novels by clicking on the Buy the Books link that takes you to Nowhere Bookshop. And I hope you enjoy attending all the other great sessions here at this year's festival. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, everyone.
Thank you.